Um, Last week our attention was drawn to we moved towards the plot analysis. That's the last part of the narrative analysis that we do for step 4. So again, the plot is what we were discussing last week. And I think last week we talked about, let me just review a couple of things with you, and then we'll dive into John 4 and do the plot analysis for John 4. But just by way of reminder, what a plot is and what it does, it's important to understand that a typical plot, right, is a series of events. And again, the key is that are related to each other. They are connected in some way. They're not random. They're not haphazard, but they actually have a connection. And that's what a plot is. What it does is, by that connection, it reveals the point of the story. As we follow the plot and understand the plot, we can then understand what it is the author is trying to teach us through the narrative, through the story. And we looked at and discussed the key elements of the plot of the story. And again, as you look at various books on narratives, you might see a little bit of variation here and there as far as definitions and what is encompassed in each definition. But all of them will generally have the same idea, where there is an introduction usually in a story. There's a problem that takes place, then the story, and then sort of a rising action, which is really usually the bulk of the story, where that's the process. The characters are trying to overcome the problem, or the problem gets worse, or other problems come as a result. And so trying to get resolution to that. The climax is really the peak of the story, where everything comes to a head, and where you're going to either have the problem resolved in one way or another. Either it's resolved and everyone's happy, or maybe something else happens. So like Shakespeare, he introduced the concept of tragedy, where they didn't have happy endings in the tragedies. They were actually very sad endings, but it was a resolution to the problem. Not one that we would want, but one that took place. So that climax is really, some would see as the point of resolution. Others would say it's just the point just prior to the resolution, where things are at their worst and you don't know what is going to happen. And then right after that is the resolution, or some term it as the falling action, where the problem is resolved, again, good or bad, and the story comes to its closing moments. And then you have a conclusion, which is the completion of the story. And again, with an ending. Sometimes maybe there's commentary. And then if this is a movie series or a TV series, there's going to be some little twist at the very end to make you tune in next week to watch the next story. But again, basically, most stories follow this kind of a pattern. All right. Not every story follows it exactly. And I think, as we talked about a little bit last week, when we're looking at narratives in Scripture, in particular, we have sometimes self-contained stories, which will have sort of this problem resolution, format. But sometimes some stories are part of more of the bigger. All the stories are part of the bigger plot, but some of them don't have their own problem and resolution, because they're placed there by the author to contribute to the rising action, climax, etc., of the overall narrative, the whole gospel, for example. But sometimes within a gospel, and especially in John's case, you'll have sort of these self-contained stories that also have a point within themselves that is linked to the larger point of the whole gospel. And that's what makes narratives a challenge, I think, in understanding and teaching them, because sometimes you're confronted with, okay, is this part of the bigger story, or is there another point here that the author's wanting us to see? Sort of like this Joseph story, right, which is Genesis 37 to 50, which has its own focus, which is the sovereign hand of God, but also it's connected to the broader plot of the Pentateuch, which, by the way, that is the one book, right? It's not 5 separate books. The Pentateuch is one book written by Moses for the purpose of essentially showing God's faithfulness to his covenant with his people. And you can see how Genesis 37 to 50 does have sort of its own problem, rising action, climax, and falling action, right? As we think about, let's talk about that a minute. Joseph's story. What would be the problem in his story as we just think about Genesis 37 to 50? Anyone want to answer that?
He was betrayed by his brothers and sold into he was betrayed by his brothers and sold.
Uh-oh. I think we lost Pastor Ravi. You still there? I heard the first part of that. Yeah, he was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, this whole interfamily conflict that resulted in Joseph being unjustly eliminated by his brothers, certainly that is a problem. Like, what's going to happen to Joseph? And sort of the story just unfolds, and actually the problem it seems to get better, then it gets worse, right? So in the story itself, the problem seems to be, right, Joseph's plight as he's unjustly enslaved and unjustly imprisoned. And then he rises up second to Pharaoh. Now, if the problem in the story was only the injustice against Joseph, then the resolution might be, right, that, well, he's now made the, second in command of Egypt, and his father sees him alive, everything's great. But then we realize that that's not all that's going on in the story. And there's actually a connection to Joseph's story with the bigger story of the Pentateuch. What is that connection? Anybody have a thought? And it's connected to, Joseph gives the sort of the theme of his story toward the end of it, right? You meant it for evil, God meant it for good, right? Well, what was the good?
God wanting to preserve the lineage, the people of Israel, and how they're going to experience the blessings that God had promised through Abraham, in terms of being able to reach the promised land, and the people be guided and protected all the way along the way.
Well put. That's really well put. Yes. I mean, that's exactly the point. There is not just Joseph, is vindicated, but it's that God is showing his faithfulness by his providential hand, his faithfulness to keep his promise. Because what happens if Jacob's family dies in the famine? Right? We've got a problem. And not just that Jacob's family died, we have a problem now with God not keeping his promise. And not, as you said, Ince, I think the Abrahamic covenant really is a key, because that really begins the rest of the Pentateuch, right? In Genesis 12, the first 11 chapters sort of set up the the foundation of, God as creator, sin, the fall, the promise of the coming one, the flood, and again, that's showing the depth of man's sin and God's wrath, Tower of Babel. And then you have Genesis 12, where all of a sudden everything just focuses really on Abraham and his family, his son and his grandson. That's the rest of Genesis. And then Exodus is basically the offspring of Jacob and what happens to them. But in all of it, the focus of the Pentateuch is God's faithfulness to keep his promise to Abraham and his commitment to God's people and expectation that they are faithful to their promise to keep the covenant, the Mosaic covenant. So the Joseph story sort of has the problem in the Joseph story is connected to the bigger problem in the whole Pentateuch, or it would create a problem if Jacob's family, and we don't know the bigger problem until toward the middle of the story, right? At the beginning, it's just Joseph and this problem with his brothers. And certainly that was a problem. And certainly the story follows Joseph's life. But all of a sudden, as we get later in the story, we're like, hey, there's a famine here. This is going to be a problem for Jacob's family. And then we learn, at the end of the story, Joseph says, you know what? God had the big picture in mind the whole time here. And you sent me here out of evil, but God sent me here for good to preserve your life. Well, why is that important? Because without Jacob's family, if they all die, we've got an issue, a theological issue. It's the same in like Genesis 22. When Abraham and Isaac, I think we talked about that in class way back when. But Genesis 22 has the problem of Abraham being told he needs to sacrifice his son. Well, that actually is part of a bigger problem, because if Isaac dies, then the son of promise dies, then God's faithfulness is now in question to keep his promises. And that's again, we see time and time again throughout the Pentateuch, it keeps coming back to God's faithfulness. That's why when he reveals himself at the burning bush, and he says, I am, it's not just the I am, the eternally existent one. That's a part of it. But in the context of the Pentateuch, it is I am the faithful covenant-keeping God. Forever. I will never fail to keep my promise. So that's just one example. The Joseph narrative does have sort of its own plot, but that's linked into the plot of the bigger story, which is the Pentateuch. And so it's important as you guys preach through, if you're preaching through narratives, I think, Robbie, you mentioned you're doing Samuel, that you understand sort of, look at, okay, does this story sort of have its own kind of plot? And then how is that plot linked to the bigger one of the whole narrative? And that can be an extreme challenge at times. Sometimes it's just one small piece, like the wedding at Cana, like we talked about last week or the week before. It's one small piece to the bigger picture. But it at times can be difficult to know, okay, what is the author doing here with this story? Is he giving us sort of a kind of like a self-contained story with its own plot that somehow, is part of the bigger story, or is really this a link to the overarching plot of the whole narrative? That can be a big challenge at times when you're going through narratives. And often why we end up usually, with a narrative, just sort of looking for those timeless truths and just treating it as a doctrinal, looking for the doctrines that we see in the narrative, as opposed to first looking for what is the author wanting us to understand, as far as his point of his story. So plot analysis, can be can be, it has its challenges, but any comments or questions on that so far before we go forward? Does that make sense? Any questions?
Yeah.
Pastor Tim.
Yes.
Okay. To get a reference material in terms of background and plot of a certain book, can we use those things as give us an insight? Because I mean, as a lay person, would not have the time, the luxury, and the wisdom to really understand the whole of a certain. So, will I not be in violation of plagiarism if I use these materials just for me to give the overall picture of a certain book in reference to other books or something like that?
Sure. I mean, resources are a very helpful tool for us. In the exegetical process, especially, as long as they're good tools, good resources. So you want to find those that are going to be helpful. And so as we talk about sort of these principles of how to study a narrative, then you're going to want to look for resources that understand that. For example, I found Dale Ralph Davis. He's a Old Testament scholar. He's written several very helpful, I wouldn't call them commentaries, but because he basically writes them like they're written like narratives. So he's got on Joshua, 1st, 2nd Samuel, I think 1st, 2nd Kings. And I really like him because he understands the concept of narrative. So as he's going through the story, he doesn't do like a verse by verse commentary, but really looks at sort of the plot of the story and tries to help the reader of his commentary see that plot as it unfolds. And he'll identify the key themes as it relates to the author's point. So I think he does a good job with narratives, but you won't find like a lot of exegetical, word studies or technical information in his commentaries, but they're a very helpful resource. It's another one. I had it in my like D.A. Carson's got a helpful commentary on John, where he, I think, recognizes the elements of narrative. So you just want to look at resources that are going to recognize key elements of narratives and point it out, not just ones that will kind of go verse by verse and explain the doctrines that we see. And there's nothing wrong with that. Certainly doctrines everywhere in the Bible. And we want to take note of it, but with narratives, you want to not sacrifice the understanding of the author's point of his story. There was one resource. One that I found helpful generally that gives overall picture of the book is the, what are those called? They're videos on YouTube now. Let me look it up. I know some of you guys will be familiar with these. I just, for some reason, it's not coming into my mind here. But I found them to be helpful because they just look at, they've kind of done each book. Let's see here. Descriptions. The overall message of the book and sort of the structure of the book.
Is that a walk through the Bible, Pastor?
No, but that I really like that book. Walk through or talk through the Bible.
Mm.
Which one did you mention? Oh, where did it
Yeah.
go?
Through and talk through. Yeah.
Mm.
What happened to my? Okay, here. Oh, I think it's called the Bible Project.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, is that it? Bible Project. Yes. So, for example, let's see. Let's take. Let me see if I can find one here we can watch. They're doing a lot of special ones now, but let's see. I think they've done overviews of every book, and I found those helpful. Let's pick one here. And I can't,
If you open a Protestant Christian Bible and look at the table of contents,
okay,
you'll
you
notice
can
the
hear.
first 3 quarters is a collect.
So here, all right. I don't know if can you see this on your screen? The video?
The books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. They're 2
Can you
separate
Yep.
books in our modern Bible.
Yes.
Can you guys hear it
That
okay?
division is due simply to
Mm,
scroll.
yeah.
It was originally written as one coherent story. We're just going to cover the book of 1 Samuel in this video. So after Israel was rescued from slavery in Egypt, they made a covenant with God at Mount Sinai and eventually came
Okay,
into
let me
the books of
let me
1st and
preface this. So we'll spend a few minutes and watch this just so you can get an idea. If you guys haven't seen this resource, I think it's a really helpful one just to give the big picture. Now, as with any resource, I don't endorse everything that these guys have said. I don't agree with their view of Revelation. For example, they are not as explicit about repentance. So there's been some concerns about that with these guys, but that said, I found a lot of their videos to be helpful, at least the ones that focus on the book, the whole message of the whole book. All right. They're doing a lot of special topic ones now, and I honestly haven't looked at those, so I don't know if how good they are. But these guys do a really good job of kind of showing you the book as a whole, and they do it visually. They're very good. So let's just watch this one. This is 1 Samuel. But listen at the very beginning what he says here, which I think is helpful. So here we go.
the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. They're 2 separate books in our modern Bibles, but that division is due simply to scroll length. It was originally written as one coherent story. We're just going to cover the book of 1 Samuel in this video. So after Israel was rescued from slavery in Egypt, they made a covenant with God at Mount Sinai and eventually came into the promised land. And there Israel was supposed to be faithful to God and obey the covenant commands. Before the book of Samuel, Judges showed how Israel failed at that task big time. It was a period of moral chaos, and it showed Israel's need for wise, faithful leaders. The book of Samuel provides an answer to that need. The book of Samuel's story focuses on 3 main characters: the prophet Samuel, where the book gets its name, and then King Saul, and after that, King David. And all 3 of them transitioned Israel from a group of tribes ruled by judges into a unified kingdom ruled by King David in Jerusalem. And the book of Samuel has a fascinating design that weaves the story of these 3 characters together in 4 main parts. Samuel.
Sorry, I'll try not to do this too much so you can watch but notice how he's identifying the key characters. He's sort of giving you the overarching focus here, which is transitioning from the time of Judges to the time of the king, the first King David. Well, he's second king technically. And then that they mentioned, this is actually part of one connected 1st and 2nd Samuel are actually one book together. And so those, again, this shows you they're thinking with a narrative perspective. All right. They're looking at the story as a whole. All right. I'll try to keep quiet for the rest here.
Well, he's the key leader and prophet in the first section of the book, but then he also plays a key role in the next section, which is Saul's story. And it's told in two movements: Saul's rise to power and then his failures. And the second part is about his downfall and his tragic death. And then the drama of Saul's demise is matched by David's exciting rise to power. And then David's story is told in two movements. First, he rides the wave of his success, followed by his own tragic failure and the slow self-destruction of his family and then his kingdom. The book concludes with an epilogue that reflects back over the whole story. So let's dive in and see how this all unfolds. Part one picks up from the chaos of the book of Judges, and we're introduced to a touching story about a woman named Hannah. And she's grieved because she has never been able to have children. And by God's grace, she finally has a son named Samuel. And in joy, she sings this amazing poem in chapter 2. And the poem is all about how God opposes the proud and exalts the humble, about how despite tragedies and human evil, God is working out his purposes in history. And also it's about how God will one day raise up an anointed king for his people. Now, Hannah's poem has been placed here at the beginning of the book to introduce these key themes that we're going to see throughout the whole story, like the next one. Samuel grows up and becomes a great prophet and leader for the people of Israel, at the same time that the Philistines rise to power as Israel's arch nemesis. And in this crucial battle, the Israelites get arrogant, and instead of praying and asking God for help, they trot out the Ark of the Covenant as this kind of magic trophy that will automatically grant them victory in battle. And so because of their arrogant presumption, God allows Israel to lose the battle and the ark is stolen. So the Philistines, they take the ark and they place it in the temple of their god, Dagon. And then the God of Israel defeats the Philistines and the god Dagon without an army by sending plagues on the people. And then the Philistines don't want the ark anymore, obviously, and they send it back to Israel. And the point of this little story seems to be this: God is not Israel's trophy, and he opposes pride among the Philistines, but also among his own people. And so Israel needs to remain humble and obedient if they want to experience God's covenant blessing, which opens up into the next large section. The Israelites come to Samuel and they say, hey, we want a king like all the other nations have. Go find one for us. And so Samuel, he's kind of ticked off and he goes to consult with God. And God says, yes, their motives are all wrong, but if a king is what they want, give them one. And so we're introduced to the figure of Saul. Now, Saul is a tragic figure because he begins full of promise. He's tall, he's good looking, he's a perfect candidate for a king, but he has deep character flaws. He's dishonest, he lacks integrity, and he seems incapable of acknowledging his own mistakes. And so these flaws become his downfall. He wins some battles at the beginning, but his flaws run so deep, he eventually disqualifies himself by blatantly disobeying God's commands. And so the aging Samuel confronts Saul and Israel. He had warned the people that they would only benefit from a king who's humble and faithful to God. Otherwise, the kings of Israel will bring ruin. So he informs Saul that God is going to raise up a new king to replace him. And so Saul's downfall begins, as God at the same time is working behind the scenes to raise up that new king. It's an insignificant shepherd boy named David. He's the least likely candidate to be king, but the famous story of David and Goliath shows that God's choice of David is not based on his family status, but simply on his radical and humble trust in the God of Israel. And so this story embodies all of the themes of Hannah's poem. Proud Saul and Goliath are brought low, while humble David is exalted. From here, we watch Saul slowly descend into madness, while David rises to power. So David starts working for Saul as a general, and he's winning all of the battles, and he's also winning all of the fame. And so Saul gets jealous, and he starts chasing David around, hunting him, trying to kill him. David's done nothing wrong. And so David simply runs and waits in the wilderness. And here we see David's true character. He has multiple opportunities to kill Saul, but he doesn't. He simply trusts that despite Saul's evil, God will raise up a king for his people. What's interesting too is that many of the poems of David that you find in the Book of Psalms are linked to this very period of his life, and they all express the same attitude of trust. And so this section of the book ends with Saul coming to a grisly death after losing a battle with the Philistines. First Samuel tells some of the most intricate, well-told stories you find anywhere in the Bible, and the characters Saul and David, they're portrayed very realistically. And the author's putting them forward as character studies so that you can find yourself in them. So in Saul's story, we see a warning. It's crucial that we reflect on our own character flaws and how they harm us and other people. And with God's help, we need to humble ourselves and deal with our dark side so that Saul's story doesn't become ours. David, on the other hand, is presented as an example of patience and trust in God's timing in our lives. And so he's running in the wilderness, being chased by Saul. David had every reason to think that God had abandoned him, but that's not what he thinks. And so David's story encourages us to trust that despite human evil, God is working out his purposes to oppose the proud and to exalt the humble. And that's what 1 Samuel is all about.
Okay, so that just gives you a taste. Obviously, I think notice again, they do see the connection, 1st and 2nd Samuel as one book, and then tries to sort of show how Hannah's prayer and why the author would include it. Did you catch that? You know, why it was there in the beginning. It opens up some themes in the book. The only thing I would say is really, instead of saying character studies, I really say they don't discuss so much about what the book teaches us about God. And really it's you know, God's man versus the people's man. It's kind of the Saul and David. So like I said, I wouldn't hold to everything they have, but there's some really helpful insights. I think they do a really good job of sort of opening up some key ideas in the book. And so I would recommend these series, at least in regards to the book overviews. I can't speak for, they're doing a lot of other stuff too, but and you know, these are catchy, you know, they can hold your attention, right? Really good graphics. At least for me, I'd have a bunch of stick figures if I was doing this, but so I don't know. Any thoughts or feedback there? Have you guys seen these videos before, or others like it? You familiar with them?
Tim?
Yeah.
When I started the 1 Samuel series, what I did was do an even more general overview between the two books of Samuel. Of course, referencing the fact that it only comes as one book originally, but the bigger picture really is not just Samuel and Saul and David in 1 Samuel, but really the introduction of the kingdom in the bigger picture. There is a bigger picture to the bigger picture, where I reference the importance of the introduction of David as the ancestor of the greater David, Jesus Christ. So my question is, because I did not do a whole summary like this, like a survey of all the sections and chapters of both books. I just gave one general overview, ending really with the connection to the greater David, the Messiah, in the beginning of the series. So we don't have to do this like a survey of the two books, right? In our introduction, just a general.
Yeah,
I guess that's my question.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't think you'd necessarily have to do an overview as you introduce the sermons. I think we should be able to do that ourselves.
Yeah.
Just to show we understand where the whole book's going.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know that you would have to do all that up front. You know, some
I
people
guess if
do,
we're
but
yeah, I guess if we're doing a survey, this
yes,
approach would be very helpful, right?
yes,
So I just gave the bigger picture, not just the kingdom, but importance of David to like we're in 1 Samuel 16 now, and I just referenced back when David was anointed by Samuel. I just referenced back to the fulfillment of the Book of Ruth in Ruth chapter 4, just to connect it back there. So, which was what the Book of Ruth was really all about.
yes. Yeah, really, Ruth is a I almost would, before I teach Samuel, I almost would do at least a 1 week on Ruth. Or, you know, something like that, like, because that would allow for you to introduce the time period. Because I don't think we can appreciate Samuel, the book of Samuel, fully unless we really understand what the state of Israel was in, and the chaos, the confusion, the immorality, the rebellion, just Israel was in bad shape. And just look at all the stories in Judges that tells you. So I think you know, that would be an important thing, is helping people understand the historical backdrop of the book. And I think they would appreciate more its significance with understanding that, because it bridges, right? Samuel's the last judge.
That's correct.
So he's bridging from Judges. So I would at least want to have, you know, people understand the historical background, the setting of this book. You know, that would be more of the introduction. You know, we just always feel this pressure that we have to have some you know, immediate application from every, but that's hard to do when you're doing a large story, right? Because you're only dealing with a few key themes, honestly. And so the challenge is not to look for some application point every time along the way in every story, because sometimes some stories are given without really an intended application by the author. Okay. So certainly we can draw application from examples of people and things like that, but we want to be careful that we don't teach that as a hermeneutic. You know, right. So yeah, I don't think you'd have to do like this whole overarching thing unless you're doing a Bible survey. But I think at least we as the expositor should be able to have this in our minds, you know, what that big picture is, so we know where each story fits. And over time, you'll be unfolding that plot as these guys did. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, it does. I think it was helpful also that I just kept reminding, at least for the first 7 chapters, reminding the congregation that at this point, basically, we're still in the period of the book of Judges, with Samuel being the last judge. So they could understand the character of the people during those first 7. Even Eli and his sons, for example, were an example of that. So
yeah, and I think, you know, these guys, as they brought out that theme of, you know, God opposes the proud, gives grace to the humble, you know, that certainly we can see that playing out as the people. How do they respond? And they want a king like the nations.
Mm.
And so,
Yeah.
you know, again, it's important to see, okay, what is God showing us about himself as the story unfolds? And yeah, certainly we have the bigger picture. This is introducing David, who is the one that God promises the Messiah would come from his line, that he would have a son who would reign forever. So David is a key, just like Moses, David is a key person in the whole unfolding of scripture. So there's and that's affirmed by other places, like Ruth, for example. Psalm 78 is another example that David is described as a blessing given to Israel. I think he wasn't a perfect guy. He did some pretty wicked stuff. But at the same time, we still need to recognize his position in God's unfolding redemptive plan. So yeah, so I just wanted to, I think, Brother Raleigh asked a good question about resources. And certainly, my encouragement always to you guys is do as much as you can on your own first. That will pay off in the long term, but that's the harder route and that's the longer route. But also we must have good resources. And so what you want to do for narratives is find resources that understand how narratives work. They will give you a lot of good input. So I have a hard time finding good commentaries on narratives, honestly, that treat them like narratives. But I mentioned a couple that I think were helpful. Okay, did that help, Raleigh? I don't know. That was kind of a long response to your question, but
Yeah. Can I give you an assignment and give us some reference that you think will be helpful for us? A good reference material in terms of narrative. You don't have to give it to us now. That will be your assignment.
okay. Yeah, I'll see if I can come up with some more that that I can recommend. But the Bible Project's a good one for the books overall. Talk Through the Bible is another good resource, looking at the books as a whole. But even there, I have to remember some of the narratives, the approach they took. I have to look again. But I like that resource overall. Okay. All right, let's get to John here. Again, just by way of review, remembering the steps for plot analysis. First is to identify the plot details that we just looked at here. Identify those in the story. And then secondly, summarize the narrator comments in the story. And again, as we discussed before, of course, we've talked about narrator comments quite often in different steps here. We looked at narrator comments in the character analysis and the scene analysis. Here we're looking at summarizing the narrator comments just again in light of the plot of the story, the bigger picture of the story. Some of this may be repetitive, things you've already seen, but sometimes you might see additional details from what the narrator is saying in the bigger picture. All right, so just again summarize his comments. And here I would also encourage you to include any literary devices that he uses, like irony or repetition, and looking at the story as a whole. All right, so in that regard, describe what the story teaches about God. And then what's the author's point? The last step in plot analysis is now putting everything together. What is the author's point? What is he trying to communicate through the story? And part of that last step will be considering how that story fits to what came before, to what comes after, to the bigger picture, the bigger part of the book. Kind of like what we were seeing in that video. They were trying to show the overall picture. So how does your story fit in that overall plot to the book? All right, so those are the steps. So what I'd like to do now is take the time that we have left, just let's read through John, and we'll just see how far we get on the plot analysis here. But let's read through the story together. And I broke it up by scenes. So we'll start with BJ. If you could read verses 1 to 6, and then Ince 7 to 12. Tabs, if you could follow Ince. And Robbie, if you could follow Tabs. Jason, Renee, Raleigh, we'll see. I don't know how many paragraphs there are here to read, so. But BJ, you want to start us off? Just read verses 1 to 6 there.
Yes, Pastor Tim. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Now, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, worried as he was from his journey, was thinking it was about the 6th hour.
Verses 7 to 12. There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Therefore the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I am a Samaritan woman?" For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." She said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? You are not greater than our father Jacob, are you, who gave us the well and drank of it himself and his sons and his cattle?"
Verses 13 to 19. Jesus answered and said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so I will not be thirsty nor come all the way here to draw." He said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman answered and said, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You have correctly said, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. This you have said truly." The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet."
Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You will worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people, the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When that one comes, he will declare all things to us." Jesus said to her, "I who speak to you am he.
Verse 27 to 32. At this point, his disciples came, and they were amazed that he had been speaking with a woman. Yet no one said, "What do you seek?" or "Why do you speak with her?" And so the woman left her water pot and went into the city and said to the men, "Come, see a man who told me all the things that I have done. This is not the Christ, is it?" They went out of the city and were coming to him. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, "Rabbi, eat." But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you do not know about."
Verse 33 to 38. So the disciples were saying to one another, "No one bought him anything to eat, did he?" Jesus said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Do you not say, 'There are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest'? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, they that they are white for harvest. Already he who reaps is receiving wages and is gathering fruit for life eternal, so that he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. For in this case the saying is true, the one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap for which you have not labored. Others have labored, and you and have entered into their labor.
Oh, we lost Raleigh. See who started. Tabs, did you start? Or BJ, you did. Why don't you finish up, BJ? The last verses here.
Verse 39. Many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me all that I ever did. So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. And many more believed because of his word. They said to the woman, "It is no longer because of what you have said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is indeed the Savior of the world."
Okay, so as we think about in the plot analysis, again, the first step is to identify the plot details. That is, try to identify each of these elements of the plot. All right, and this is just an initial attempt. All right, we may refine it as we go forward, but we initially want to just try, okay, can I identify each of those particular components? The introduction, the problem, the rising action, the climax, falling action, and the conclusion. So as we think about that, it's kind of hard for me to show both things here at the same time, the text and the notes here. But what do you guys think would be the introduction to the story?
In a single statement, or
Like what verses cover
oh,
each of these?
no, well, verses 1 to 6. Of course,
Yeah, I
will
think
be
for
the
this one, it's pretty
introduction, yeah.
straightforward, right?
Yeah.
The whole setting here is given
Mm,
in detail. And then the story begins in verse 7. So the introduction, yeah, be verses 1 to 6, the setting. Now the problem, we've discussed this, but Tabs, what would you say? What verses would cover the problem or introduce the problem or?
I think, Pastor, that the problem would be introduced starting verse 7 all the way to. up to verse 14, Pastor.
Okay, so you would include some of this dialogue then between them as well, or
Okay. I think, Pastor, that the problem would be specifically verse 9,
yeah, I would
where
say
it says,
yes.
yes, Pastor.
Yeah, for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans, and even the woman's acknowledgement of that. So I think, again, as we previously sort of defined or described the problem here is Jesus not just interacting with this woman, but the problem, was the cultural, we called it the cultural prejudice that would forbid Jesus to speak with the woman. And as we studied the story in broader scope, right, it really would be a hindrance to the gospel going to those outside of Israel, right? Again, this is where the plot, now that we've done a lot of study already, we can kind of look at this a little bit more interpretive now.
Yeah.
Now that we've sort of seen the story as a whole, we've done the scene analysis, character analysis, setting analysis. We kind of look at this as not just the issue here, Jesus not being able to talk to this woman, but why is that a problem? Why is that a big deal in John's gospel? Well, how in the world, if John's gospel is focused on, that the reader would believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that believing would have life in his name. Well, what's the problem here? Well, this cultural prejudice would prevent that message from going to these Samaritans in this case. So the problem here is that cultural prejudice is a hindrance to the gospel. You see what I'm saying with plot? Of course, with the story, the focus is Jesus and the woman. So within the confines of the story, that's the problem. Oh, Jesus is talking to this immoral Samaritan woman. He shouldn't be doing that. Now, in the rising action, if we would call it, and so it's verses 7 and 9, especially verse 9, identifies this problem. The rising action, that is the next part of here. What, anybody have an idea what the rising action, again, that would be just sort of the problem grows or the story continues towards a climax of the problem. What would that be here in this story, you think? Where would the rising action be?
I think it's the dialogue between the Lord and the woman from verse 10 all the way to verse 30. This whole exchange.
Yeah, her exchange, yeah, goes up to verse 26. And then that's when the disciples arrive.
Yeah, verse 26. Yeah, verse 26.
So this
right,
is Jesus's dialogue with the woman. All right, so that just continues on. Then in verse 27 is almost like the climax in a sense of this story, because the disciples now return and they see Jesus speaking with this woman, right? They were amazed. He was speaking with a woman, and this woman in particular, this Samaritan woman, but no one said anything. So this is really kind of in a sense, the climax of John 4 is the disciples arrive. How would they respond? They arrive seeing Jesus, because again, remember, they didn't know what was going on, right? They left Jesus at the well. They had no idea he was in this conversation with this Samaritan woman until they come back. And then they see it. And so as the reader of the story, knowing the cultural background here, it's like, oh, uh-oh, what's going to happen now? What are the disciples going to do? What's Jesus going to do? All right. And then we sort of have the resolution of the story. So what happens as we reach this climax? How would the disciples respond? What would they do? What would Jesus do? That's really the rest of I would say verses 28 to around 41. We get the resolution, really, and that's really connected to the point of the story, right? When we see verses 28 to 41, what seems to be the focus in these verses? How does this problem get addressed? What do you think, Ents?
I think Christ reminded the disciples that he has come to fulfill the mission of reaching the lost, not just the Jews, but also Gentiles, just like the Samaritans. Showing them that he is indeed the Savior of the world.
Yes, good. He reminds the disciples he has come to fulfill the mission to reach the lost. And we could add what else?
That he has sent them
Yes,
to do the same.
they are a part of that same mission. Okay, so what's the resolution to the problem? Well, one, Jesus brings the gospel to these people, and two, tells them, the disciples, you need to be doing the same thing. I've been sent. I'm sending you. All right, that's kind of the overall gist, and I would see the conclusion really being the statement made by the Samaritan people. And just as you said, Ents, the concluding that Jesus is the Savior of the world. All right, so I would see the conclusion really as sort of verse 42. We know Jesus is the Savior of, and then we really want to put in caps here, the world. All right, so sort of this gospel is for, not only the Jews, but any who are lost. And added to that, Jesus wants the disciples to recognize, in spite of the cultural prejudice around you, you need to be on the same mission. I didn't just come for the Jews, I came for the world. And you've been sent as well. And it's interesting, many of the apostles did end up becoming missionaries. Some stayed in Jerusalem. Initially, they all stayed in Jerusalem, but over time they spread out, right? Thomas historically is known to have gone to India, had a tremendous impact there. Of course, Paul ended up, he wasn't here in this story, but he ends up, obviously taking the gospel all over the Roman Empire. But yeah, so this is where I would see again in John 4, it's like in the overarching narrative where John again wants the reader to understand Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. He sprinkles in these kinds of things that, again, as I told you before, that word send or sent is a key word in John. So laced within his narrative is the Great Commission. And we see it pop out here. that in this desire to have all who read this gospel know that he's the Christ, the Son of the living God, John doesn't want us to forget that we are part of the mission to make this Jesus known, and not just known to our local people that we are comfortable with, but known to the world. This is a great missions passage. Honestly, it's a great commission passage, and it's also a great missions passage. And I think we wouldn't be abusing the author's intent by taking it those directions, because I think he is. And he does it by introducing the cultural problem, but he does that introduction in a very subtle way, just with a parenthetical statement in verse 9. Jews have no dealings with Samaritans, also including the woman's comment. And then again in verse 27, the narrator makes the comment, they were amazed, he's speaking with a woman. And then we have Jesus's, as he addresses them here, I've been sent and I sent you. Okay? So this is at least how I would see the plot, the deep plot details, the key elements in the plot of the story, because we can see it in this account. We do see, I think, John introducing a problem in the story that does get resolved within the story. Any thoughts about this? What are your feedback or questions, or would you see it a little differently, or does it make sense? What do you guys think?
I'm still I still have that notion of the climax as the high point of the story, and so if it would be the high point, I would be including the conversation from verse 31 to verse 38 as the climax. This is the high point of the story, when the Lord was telling them about his mission, their mission. So I need to remind myself that this is the climax, is when the problem gets worse. And so the falling action is when the problem is being resolved. So I need to get around that.
Well, and honestly, Robbie, to me, part of that's just sort of how people have defined things. Some people include a climax resolution as part of the same. At the end of the day, we're still just, I would, see the story like this with this figure here. If I can get to it, where we do have this same figure, and some people might just put, climax and resolution. They might look at it like this more. Oops, let me do this. What happened here? We have two of those. Okay. Or they kind of just, this whole part is just one thing, and that's fine. Where the story reaches its height and then everything gets resolved, that's fine. I think the key is to see, the real key, I think, in understanding how stories work is problem, problem resolution.
Yeah.
That's a story. A plot. There's a, so introduction, okay, so it kind of gives some preliminary information, the problem's revealed, then they try to deal with this problem, but at some point, the problem gets addressed, either for good or for bad. And we can call that the climax is the height of that problem. The resolution is the solving of it. You could combine those concepts together. Honestly, it does, to me, it doesn't matter so much, at least as long as we recognize that a story has the problem and resolution. If you can't identify a problem and a resolution, then either we don't understand the story, or perhaps, like I said, if it's part of a larger narrative, then that story may not have a problem resolution in itself, but it's more connected to the bigger problem resolution of the whole narrative. But you know, this is really, I would say, that the core of a plot includes as these two elements, the problem and the resolution. So I don't know if that helps a little bit, Robbie. Don't get hung up on the.
Yeah.
I just was trying to
helps.
break it down a little more,
Yeah.
and kind of understanding how a lot of books will talk about narratives and how they're structured. And so I've seen some where they have like 10 or 12 elements to a story, and it's just too complicated. But usually I think if you look at it as these two, I mean, they're the real core. And then, you know, like I said, sometimes people might add an introduction because that sort of gives a setting. Then you have the problem come out. Then you have sort of the rising action. And then really the resolution. And then some might break that out as there's the climax, which is sort of the you know, just prior to the resolution. All right, you kind of just think of it like you're going up a mountain, and as you just get to that top part of the mountain, so things will start to resolve, but there is a peak. And I think in this story, if the problem is that cultural prejudice, the peak really is when the disciples show up. It's like, okay, what's going to go on? What's going to go down now? Are the disciples going to rebuke Jesus? Is Jesus just going to, you know, move on with things? And he doesn't, right? They have a dialogue. Because again, if the story is just about the Samaritan woman, we don't have verses 27 to 38.
Yeah.
So certainly I believe that all of that's part of the resolution, if you will, the climax and the resolution. So the beginning of that resolution is verse 27.
Yeah.
So that's why I add the element of a climax, because it just like David and Goliath, you know, the peak there is right before, as the battle begins. All right, here we are. What's going to happen? So the climax is sort of that, and usually it's short. It's just going to be a verse or something, because it's right at the edge, right at the very precipice of this problem, getting a resolution. And then the resolution's often extended, like David and Goliath. It's not just that he kills Goliath; he cuts off his head. All the Philistines flee. You know, there's this. David is exalted, rewarded, that kind of thing. So, but really, again, a problem, and resolution are the thing you want to keep your focus on. Does that help?
Yep.
Other questions, comments, as we look at, oops, where did it go? Oh, there it is. All right. Okay, what time do we have here? Let's see. What do we got left? Narrator comments. Author's point. Okay, why don't we just we can stop here. Next week, we'll just summarize the narrator comments as it pertains to the overall plot. Describe what the story teaches about God. And we could talk a little about that, the point of the story. And then what I'd like to talk about maybe is a few implications, or just as you think about applications for this story, what would be appropriate, what might be things that are abuses. Maybe just talk more about just kind of how this story is treated as far as being preached, and the good, the bad, and the ugly, so to speak, of because I've seen people take this story in some pretty strange directions, just in search of, an application they want to make. And that, of course, is true in many. We know many examples. We've probably done many examples ourselves as well, but I think it'd be helpful just to talk about, okay, what would be appropriate ways to apply this story, and what might be some ways that we might want to think about before we would consider doing it that. So, okay.
Got it.
All right. Well, thanks, brothers. It's good to
Thank you.
good to be together again, and look forward to kind of closing up this story. We'll talk about, like I said, maybe considerations for preaching it, and things like that next time. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Jason, you want to